Yeah, thank you, Selby. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all the participants. On behalf of the IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Srimati Shyamala Gopinath, Independent Women Director of BASF India and former Deputy Governor RBI, and Shri Ashok Soota, Executive Chairman, Happiest Minds Technologies Limited, to address our members on the topic Business Imperatives of Good Corporate Governance. This chat is being organized under the Chamber's new initiative, Thought Leadership Series, under which the Chamber invites thought leaders from diverse domains to engage in discussions on topical issues for the benefit of our members. This topic today, this evening, is very relevant in view of, as we see in India specifically, time to time, we get scams coming up all over the country. This is largely, as I see it from my personal perspective, is that where there's a lack of corporate governance, where there's lack of following mandated statutory requirements, the governance, the oversight of the board is not very good. All these issues ultimately turn up when the oversight is lost on many areas of corporate structure and governance and systems. We come to bear the scams that are operating in the country, and they're large scams which ultimately affects the taxpayers' money in one way or the other. So I think the business imperatives of good corporate governance, I think it is relevant for all kinds of companies, in my opinion. Not only listed companies, but also unlisted companies, and even smaller MSMEs, where basic issues of stakeholder management, good governance, compliances of all kinds, whatever they may be. I think that helps in creating sustainable institutions, sustainable businesses over a long term. People do find sometimes shortcuts, what sometimes we call jugaad, but I think sustainable good governance is an imperative for building successful businesses in the long run. With this few words, I'll just give a small introduction of Indian Merchants Chamber for those participants who are not familiar with the IMC. We are a voice for over 400,000 businesses and industry establishments, directly and indirectly, with 5,000 members and over 150 trade associations associated with the IMC. And we've been a chamber which is almost over 100 years old in the country. So before I hand over, I would like to introduce first Srimati Shyamala Gopinath. She is an independent woman director of BASF India Limited. She is also part-time non-executive chairperson of HDFC Bank Limited. As Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India for 7 years and member of the RBI's Board of Directors, she guided and influenced national policies in diverse areas of financial sector regulation and supervision, the development and regulation of financial markets, capital account management, management of government borrowings, foreign exchange reserves management, and payment and settlement systems. Srimati Shyamala Gopinath has served on several committees while with the RBI. During 2001 and 2003, she worked as senior financial sector expert in the then Monetary Affairs and Exchange Department of the International Monetary Fund, Financial Institutions Division. She served as chairperson, advisory board on bank, commercial and financial frauds for 2 years from 2012 and 2014. She was an independent director on the board of Clearing Corporation of India, Indian Oil Corporation Limited, GAIL, and an independent non-executive on the Global Governance Council of Ernst & Young. She was also the chairperson of the board of Corporate Bonds and Securitization Advisory Committee of Securities and Exchange Board of India. Apart from HDFC Bank, she is an independent director of a few other companies, including not-for-profit entities. She is also the chairperson of the Board of Governors of Indian Institute of Management, Raipur. She is on the board of BASF India Limited and is part of the following committees: Chairman of Audit Committee, Stakeholders Relationship Committee, Nomination and Remuneration Committee, and member of Risk Management Committee. Welcome to this program, Mrs. Gopinath.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Shri Ashok Soota, he is the current Executive Chairman, Happiest Minds Technologies Limited. Mr. Soota, Executive Chairman of Happiest Minds, is widely recognized as one of the pioneering leaders of the Indian IT industry. As a serial entrepreneur, he has led both companies he founded very successful IPOs, Happiest Minds in 2020 and Mindtree in 2007. Happiest Mind Technologies Limited is a born digital, born agile, mindful IT company that uses leading edge technologies to deliver solutions. A great place to work certified company, Happiest Mind is in the GPTW top 15 best workplaces in health and wellness, top 25 best workplaces in India, top 100 in Asia, top 50 for the women, and top 25 in IT and IT BPM, most of them for 2 to 3 consecutive years. Ashok has been the president of CII, a member of the Prime Minister's Task Force for IT, and was on the advisory council for the World Intellectual Property Organization, Geneva. He's a fellow and INAE and CSI and on the board of governors of the Asian Institute of Management, Philippines. This is an institute where Ashok and myself had the pleasure of being there for 2 years. And I think whatever successes we had or we are having, partly and largely due to what we did at AIM way back in the early 70s. He's a recipient of multiple awards for IT Person of the Year, DataQuest and Elsina, and Lifetime Achievement Financial Express, DataQuest and Chiratai Ventures, earlier IDG Ventures. Earlier this year, Ashok launched SCAN, India's first private sector-led non-profit organization exclusively dedicated to carry out medical research on aging and neurological disorders with a commitment of 21 crores. He also established at 2011 Ashwin a trust for environmental projects and assistance to the needy. Ashok holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Roorkee, now called Indian Institute of Technology in Roorkee, and a master's of business management degree from the Asian Institute of Management, Philippines. He is also on the board of governors, if I'm correct, of the Asian Institute of Management. Ashok is a co-author of the national bestseller Entrepreneurship Simplified, From Idea to IPO, and his hobbies include trekking, outdoors, yoga, tai chi, meditation, and swimming. We have an excellent duo of speakers today evening, and I welcome you all and invite Mrs. Gopinath and Shri Ashok Soota to enlighten us with their thought-provoking discussion on today's subject, business imperatives of good corporate governance. Over to you, Ashok.
Thank you, Juzar, for that very nice introduction. I may make a small little correction. The commitment to SCAN is not 21 crores, but 210, and that's just the beginning. I hope that I'll be able to put in much more.
I added one. Sorry, Ashok, I added 1 0.
You removed 1 0 actually.
Oh, it is 21 crores or
210.
Oh, 200. I'm sorry, it was written 2100 million. So I just read it as, sorry, 210 crores.
Correct.
Thank you for this correction.
Anyhow, we're getting started. Firstly, Mrs. Shamla Gopinath, my old friend Juzar, who's already told you about our common interactions in the past, and Mr. Anant Singhania, President-elect at IMC Chamber of Commerce and Industry, as well as Mr. Ajit Mangrulkar, Director General, IMC, and also members of your illustrious organization. It's a privilege to be able to address you today on the issue of good governance in this virtual program along with Shamla. As you will see, we complement each other very well. My talk is largely experience and practitioner based, whereas Shamla will really give you the legal framework and all the statutory aspects for corporate governance. And we have done this together before. It worked rather well, and I'm sure it will today too. And we will look forward towards a vigorous Q&A after the talk. There are plenty of studies and empirical evidence that show how good governance leads to sustainable value creation, accountability, effectiveness, and long-term stability of the organization. Since the theme is so vast, I will confine myself to just 6 areas where good governance can either enhance value or a few where poor governance can destroy value. The first of these is the mission, vision, and values of a company. Defining a company's mission, vision, and value may not be the first priority for a startup. And yet, if you ask me, that's a base foundation. It is essential to be able to create a vibrant, positive culture. The mission gives a company the reason for our existence. The vision articulates the measurable goals over a finite period, mostly 5 years, but this time at Happiest Minds, for the first time, I've chosen to define a 10-year vision, and values drive behavior and behavior drives results. Now, it's not enough to articulate these. These have to be internalized. They have to become shared beliefs through intense communication and practices which support these. I did this at Happiest Minds. I've done it in Mindtree. And in Happiest Minds, our values, appropriately for a company of the name that we have, also lend themselves to an acronym, SMILE, which is sharing, mindful, integrity, learning, excellence, and social responsibility. The second factor, which can really here completely destroy value, is when you overextend the organization by burdening it with debt or beyond its capacity to cope and succeed. This can lead to very swift collapse also. We can have several examples. They're the more, let's say, obvious ones of outright fraud, which would include organizations like Enron, Nirav Modi, and so on. But there are also others where they actually stretch themselves, notwithstanding all the problems of Vijay Mallya today abroad. I would say that in the beginning, he really just stretched himself with debt and could not sustain the organization. Then maybe it led to practices which obviously is very difficult to be able to assess what happened. But you could see what happened to the person, the organization, and the legacy which he inherited was completely destroyed. Lehman Brothers is another such example where suddenly it led to the collapse of almost a very large part of the financial world. The third aspect I'd like to highlight, which is really key and fundamental again, like the mission, vision, and values, is to have a great board. Now, in order to do this, you've got to be able to attract good board members. And that doesn't mean that you have to have a high profile board. They must understand the rhythms and nuances of your business. If they have complementary capabilities, it becomes wonderful. Now, I'll compare this with my own experience at Mindtree and Happiest Minds. I had the benefit of my learning experience from the first cycle. I had a very high profile board at Mindtree, and I won't say that they were not very good people. They were all good people. And yet when I come down to the level of contribution, because many of them were overseas people who really didn't understand the rhythm of our business, I think the nitty-gritty involvement, and maybe when I went to choose people, I think I now consciously chose people with complementary capabilities. So somebody with a finance background, obviously, somebody who has been the dean of a business school, and another one with a very high people orientation. I will add very soon a fourth independent director, but I'm happy that we have a very good gender diversity in our board. Another important thing, which is absolutely critical for governance, is succession planning. In every organization I've led, I've always had someone who, with the consent of the existing management, was available as an exigency chairman. If something could happen to anybody at any time. And from that angle, people must know who will be available to carry on the organization. In both the prior organizations, after a period of 7 years, I was able to tell those people who had held forth that, look, I do have a successor internally now, and thank you for being there. We won't need those services now. Which is wonderful. I brought in both cases, one person as executive vice chairman, another as MD. And then it was clear that there would be the succession for me when we moved on. I think in succession planning, it has to cover all key levels of responsibility. I believe that you must have a time horizon which looks at least 10 years ahead. I mentioned that this time I have drawn up a vision for Happiest Minds, which is a 10-year vision. And the reason is that the change is so high that I believe that the Happiest Minds of 10 years is going downstream will be dramatically different from the Happiest Minds which exist today. And it's important for us to consciously prepare for that. Also, this is linked with something which some of you may have read about, my plans of creating an organization and designing Happiest Minds to exist in perpetuity. You might say that, hey, look, an organization should logically exist in perpetuity because as a Supreme Court justice in the US said, that an organization is an immortal being. But of course, many of them collapse, many of them disappear. It's just about to happen completely to my prior company, Mindtree, which first went to a hostile acquisition after I had left. And then now you learn that it's being merged along with the acquirer, and the name itself will disappear. There are multiple ways. I won't get into the details of what I've done in terms of design, but it's something which is fundamentally very simple, actually. It merely says that I will not allow my shareholding to drop below a finite percent. I have nominated 2 generations of successors, and their job will be only to ensure that the votes go to the management of the company, and a model for that has been prepared. In the process, the flow of income coming out of my dividends and other streams has to be used to fund the plans ahead for SCAN, which I'm hoping will grow to a world-class, well-known organization. And once that's assured, having taken care of that for 2 generations, you can see that I've not created one, but really 2 organizations which can exist in perpetuity. And this is my 5th point, and this is a rather obvious one, which all of us deal with in our businesses, and that is risk management. You know, many of us who've gone through IPO processes, we've done our DRHPs, we outline all of the risks, but the danger in some of these is that they become like all-encompassing risks. It's almost like the potential, let's say, hazards of a given medicine when you take it. The medicine maker better list every conceivable thing that could go wrong, just in case something did happen and you choose to sue them. So here also, everything under the sun is listed. And in the end, you're not able to really make out what you need to focus on. You have no idea to where the risks are going to come from. More likely than not, those risks will come from unexpected sources, which is why sometimes, in spite of all of the planning, you're not able to identify the risk when it suddenly comes to you. Same, it happened with COVID-19. It happened to some people whose businesses are affected by the current war. Fortunately, not ours. But it can come from virtually anywhere. And therefore, this really needs continuous evaluation at all times. You need to have your contingency plans in place. The latest problem nowadays, if you ask me on risk, is cybersecurity. Every day there's a new threat. So therefore, you've got to do whatever you can do for prevention of your data getting lost, your consumers' data getting lost, recovery in case something does happen. We have an exercise where we do what you may call a simulation of phishing mails. And by that, I mean, our CIO sends out mails which look genuine but are not. And in spite of this being an IT company, and in spite of people knowing that I may get, because they know that we do this exercise repeatedly, people go and open the mail. And that then exposes them to the hazards of, and the guy who's designing these phishing mails are really very clever people. They know how to trap you. And you've got to be able to look out for some of the things to see that you don't suddenly expose your whole system through one of those phishing mails. I'll come now to the sixth item. And this one you might think is a little unusual when I mention this in a governance discussion, and that is the whole IPO process. Today, we are surrounded by multiple companies which are going public, unicorns which will gradually go public, and they go public at billions of dollars of market cap. Now, what happens is that in many of these, I think the valuations have been built up largely by the private equity players who have come in. The whole technique is, okay, let me put in a few $100 million and straight away I'll add that up and come to $1 billion company. What happens in a situation like this is that the only people who really make good money are the founders, if they have a significant share, the external investors, and the retailer actually just gets the thin end of the wedge. I've always had a philosophy of saying that when we go public, we must have a minimum, and I'm really emphasizing the word minimum, of a 25% upside the same day. Now, the beauty of that is the moment you do that, the public then actually responds even more positively. And therefore, it takes your upsides up even further. And in the process, everybody gains. And therefore, I'd say the key thing is you must leave enough on the table for the new retail shareholders. Now, I've covered these 6 points. I'd like to hand this back to Shyamla, and though she has also heard me before, I'm looking forward to her talk. And then, of course, our questions and answers. So thank you very much. Shyamla's been muted.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was muted.
Over to you.
First of all, thank you. Mr. Khurakiwala, President, IMT Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Shri Anand Singhania, President-elect, Selby, who is conducting this session, and of course, my co-speaker and very inspiring person,
Hello.
Shri Ashok Soota, and members of the IMC. I think I readily agreed when Ashok suggested that I join with him, more to listen to him rather than that, I should be talking to everybody here. But it's a great opportunity for me to share this panel with Ashok Soota, and I'm really looking forward to the interactive session. In fact, when I read about the chamber, and even Mr. Khurakiwala mentioned that, really speaking, this chamber itself has laid the foundations for entrepreneurship in India. And India is today very well known for being endowed with entrepreneurial skill and has become among the top countries for startups. So there's a strong association between entrepreneurship, economic growth, and innovation. And of course, India's strength in its ability to identify the opportunities and risk-taking, and link with its the link to its capabilities for product innovation and a healthy attitude towards internationalization. You see every company having some business overseas and seeking new markets beyond the home base. Of course, post pandemic, the Indian economy has also shown that Indians are very good at absorbing technology, and that is where we've really done well. And the business case for governance is proven in the case of India. In fact, I was just thinking, when really did this governance issue come up? I just thought that, probably the issue of governance in business organizations became imperative when we had the limited liability concept introduced in the company law. Earlier, the promoters and founders had really unlimited liability. And so what the limited liability concept did was to limit the liability of the founders or the promoters to their investment, which is not the case earlier. And this really encouraged risk-taking. In fact, somebody had mentioned that actually what limited liability does is not to provide rational encouragement to business initiative as such, but really by eliminating the fear of incurring personal liability, gives an unbalanced incentive for risk-taking. And when Soota mentioned about risk management, I just recalled this phrase. At the same time, the the commercial significance of limited liability cannot be overstated. In fact, again, I'll quote one of the judges in US who had said that the statutes relating to limited liability have probably done more than any other legislation to further the commercial prosperity of the country. This is, of course, centuries ago. They have, to the advantage as well as of the investor and the public, allowed and encouraged the aggregation of small or comparatively small sums into large capitals, which have been employed in undertakings of great public utility, largely increasing the wealth of the country. So I do, hope that companies realize that every company is a company of great public utility. Although there had been cases of misgovernance even earlier, for a long time, we didn't talk about governance. I think it was really the scandals like Ashok mentioned, about the Enron, the WorldCom, etc., that prompted regulatory intervention. In India, clearly it was the Satyam issue. The issue of governance arises mainly because of the separation of ownership and management. And if there are a large number of shareholders, they cannot be involved in day-to-day management. They are not owners like you own a car or a house, so where you have full control over that property. So there is need for a mechanism whereby the shareholder interests are protected from those in control of the company. And those who control the company could be either the controlling shareholders or the management. And therefore, it is the responsibility of the boards to protect interests of shareholders. In India, since the structure of the corporate system is largely promoter held, there is another form of agency conflict, which is between the dominant shareholders who also control, who also control the management of the company and the minority shareholders. Hence the need for corporate governance. So what does corporate governance do is really to have a set of principles, mainly transparency, accountability of the board, accountability of the executives to the board, fairness to all shareholders, including minorities, and to all participants in the governance structure. Some countries have codified these principles in the form of a code, which are either principle-based or rule-based. And for instance, UK, they have even made it comply or explain, because they feel that you cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy. But of course, in India, we have the SEBI regulations and the Companies Act regulations, which have almost, probably mandated all the regulations. And several committees have been set up by SEBI time and again on governance. And the latest is, of course, the Kota Committee. And here, of course, the Kota Committee made several recommendations, but it was also noted that given the sizable number of promoter-led companies that are present in the Indian market, the challenges India Inc. faces are inherently unique. There are instances of promoters carrying out actions that are favorable to them, but detrimental to the interests of the minority shareholders. These are not all companies, but there are many. And like Mr. Khurakiwala said, they have had huge implications for the stakeholders and for the taxpayers also. But it's not just promoter-led companies. We also have companies which are widely held and managed professionally. Even here, there have been problems in governance, and where the board gets dominated by the CEO, and in fact, nearly becomes subservient to management. And in fact, what Mr. Ashok mentioned about the succession planning, it doesn't really happen in a real way in such boards, because the CEO, being part of the management, wants to see that he continues, for forever. And of course, I would also like to refer to the investments made by the private equity, which is again a third form of, I would say, governance structure in India. These companies may not be listed, but definitely we have the issue of impact on public markets, particularly when the whole business model is such that there's a bias by the founders and the investors for excessive valuations, and the public markets get a raw deal. So eventually, it's all to where the concentration of power lies. So that is where the boards really come in. And the responsibility of the boards is to ensure that all stakeholders are treated fairly. And ultimately, it is the long-term interest of the company that is important, and not any one stakeholder. So when you talk about governance, such mechanisms can be either internal or external. And of course, internal governance is the relationships within the company. External corporate governance refers to outside forces that exercise a disciplining influence on managers, such as, of course, the regulatory environment, the company law regulations. I mean, why do we need regulations? It's only because, we did have several cases where the boards didn't really do their duties, and the regulators were forced to come up with the regulations. Then we have the market discipline, which is called invisible hand. That is also a form of external governance. And what Sudha mentioned about the market for corporate control or takeovers, I don't know. I'm not sure whether it's really a tool for governance or a tool for destruction. We have to see. It depends on each context. So I wouldn't like to call that a tool for external governance, although I do read several times that in India, companies don't face as much of a threat of takeovers as in some companies, as in some other countries. Of course, now you're all listening to to the Twitter case and Elon Musk taking over Twitter. I have been watching that since now I'm in the US and listening to the news. We don't know, in fact, what would happen in the longer run. And there's so much uncertainty for all the employees, for even the users of Twitter or the regulators as to, under various acts, how exactly this company will evolve. Of course, one thing is this: the starting point is to whom is the board accountable? I mean, in every case that we come about. Is it only the shareholders? Long ago in 1970, Milton Friedman had published his famous essay in the New York Times Magazine, where he argued that the social responsibility of businesses is to increase their own profits. And what we refer to as shareholder capitalism. And no doubt the companies have to be profitable and solvent in the interest of not just the shareholders, but all stakeholders. In fact, that time what Friedman was referring to was really the managerial capitalism, which he felt which is the dominance of the management in decision making, and he felt that they were taking decisions like particularly about overextending, incurring a lot of debt, building conglomerates, which he felt was really destroying value for the shareholders. And these companies had really lost their focus on the company itself. But of course, now there is a very different view, and even in US, there is a change of opinion, and the US Business Roundtable has now said that that the corporations and their managements have a responsibility to the broader group of stakeholders, including customers, suppliers, and workers. And in fact, President Joe Biden in his campaign also mentioned that the idea that a corporation's sole or primary responsibilities to the shareholders is not only wrong, it's absolute farce. But here again, I would mention that, here again, this is, I would mention about what Mr. Korakiwala mentioned, that the issue of governance is not just for listed companies or for unlisted companies, for all organizations, because every organization has stakeholders. The issue is really about the long-run value and the need for long-run value in organizations. In highly competitive markets, it is the interests of stakeholders are automatically taken into account because the labor markets are competitive, the product markets are competitive. But we don't we don't really have such highly competitive markets. So it's important to take care of the stakeholders. And during the pandemic, we have seen organizations come forward and look at the stakeholders in a much wider way, not just their employees, but their suppliers and all the entire chain. But when you talk about accountability of the board to all the environment, that is where the issue comes up as to what the boards can do. And in fact, the Companies Act has said now that the duty of the director is towards the company, the members of the company, the stakeholders, and the environment also. That is under Section 166 of the Companies Act. I think India was much ahead of other countries in defining the duty of directors in this manner. The The only issue in regard to environment is that it's important, yes, that we have some responsibility on the company, mainly because there are negative externalities from the cost of privately produced goods or services, for instance, pollution, that are not imposed on the producers or consumers, but it is imposed on the larger society. The companies will address this problem to the extent that mainly to increase their own value and to make the company sustainable in the longer run. So it's in the interest of the company itself to do it. But if significant changes have to come, for instance, to combat climate change, such externalities have to be addressed through regulation, which is imposed uniformly on all companies. And that's what we see now happening all over the world. I'll really not go into so much about the benefits of good governance, and already mentioned, definitely well-governed companies can retain hardworking, honest, they attract and retain talent. They can attract good directors, and therefore, and this itself, the governance itself will reduce the incidence of corruption, fraud, and mismanagement. In India, the governance standards are continuously being reviewed by government and SEBI in order to conform to best international practices, as well as to respond to instances of serious governance lapses and integrity issues, which can have a negative impact on the trust and confidence of investors. Since I am from the financial sector, I can say that serious misgovernance, mismanagement has, we have had such cases in so many of them in the financial services, and it has really impacted not just in many cases depositors, and affected the efficiency in the allocation of resources, and also impacted financial stability, because banks as such are highly leveraged organizations, and to say that they just take care of shareholders' interest cannot be the case, because the funding, the return on capital, when you say, is largely the depositors who fund such banks. I mean, you can't think of any other non-financial company having leverage which a financial company has, which a bank particularly, more than a financial company. Other non-NBFCs also have lower leverage than banks, and therefore it casts a huge responsibility on the boards. There is a unique fiduciary responsibility on entities such as banks, which is far more than in the case of other entities. There are other aspects to governance which are equally important. And one, of course, was mentioned by Mr. Soota, really on the succession planning. We talk a lot about succession planning, but it's particularly at the top level, it doesn't happen. Post the global, the second aspect is on conduct and culture. And that is where, the entire global financial crisis, one of the reasons attributed to that crisis was really the issue of banking conduct and culture, which was seen as a serious weakness. And this group called for sustained and comprehensive reform, mainly to restore trust in banking. And, and this trust is a bedrock of a safe and effective financial system. The RBI is now focusing on not just prudential regulation, but also on market conduct regulation. And they are looking at governance as a very important means to look at the conduct of banking of a business. And because it's strongly felt that while good performance is required to sustain a firm, this should be achieved by adhering to acceptable customer and market conduct and best governance practices. But definitely managing culture and conduct is not a one-off event. It's a continuous thing, it evolves, and leadership matters a lot. And it's not just the tone from the top, but tone from the above. The governance should permeate the entire organization. It's also important that compensation and promotion processes should take account of desired behaviors, including consequences for weak management oversight or willful blindness. People are just blind. They know what's happening, but it's never brought to the notice of the right people. And therefore, it's important to make everybody aware that unacceptable behavior and transgressions will engender appropriate discipline. Relatively, in India, governance standards are high. I won't go into really all the provisions. I would just say that, we don't have the comply or explain mechanisms. We did have for CSR, but that has also now become mandatory. There are clear rules on minimum number of independent directors, women independent director, tenure of directors, so even overboarding. If you are on too many companies, whether you'll be able to devote time and attention, composition and terms of certain committees, then related party transactions, board evaluation, and so on. There are so many, and related party transactions have been really strengthened of late. And also to reduce asymmetry of information, we have massive disclosures. Even timelines have been prescribed for reporting. While clear rules may be preferable to guidance, there are doubts, again, even in spite of all of this, whether the boards are really performing their role and the independent directors are truly independent. Episodes of misgovernance and fraud continue to raise misgivings. We've had cases which have serious conflicts of interest, massive abuse of RTPs through subsidiaries, frauds, manipulation of accounts, failure of defensive mechanism right from the bottom to the top. Both internal and external auditors probably fell asleep at the switch and failed to detect fraudulent behavior. Even transactions and organization structures were designed by companies to reduce transparency and prevent market participants and regulators from gaining a genuine picture of the firm's condition. So, therefore, both in non-financial companies, in the case of non-financial companies, we've had the banks really taking a big hit, and in financial companies, like I already mentioned, whether it was ILF, the ILFS was really a case where not just people, even mutual funds, PFs, every single, I know many PFs of companies had invested in ILFS bonds. It was considered to be like almost like public sector. So high ratings, all of that. And I think massive lessons have been learned, and even NBFCs were brought under the IBS mechanism. And when you look at, particularly in financial services, you realize that the corporate culture, whether it fosters unethical behavior and discourages questions from being asked. People are, the whistleblower mechanism is just, we wonder, in fact, most of the frauds that have come to light have been through whistleblower mechanisms. So does it really function in India? Does it really work in India? People are so scared because it's a question of their own bread and butter, when it comes to complaining. And I was just reading the papers. I don't know how far it is true that even in the case of NSE, one of the officials has said that he has a family, and and the CEO was so powerful. It was not possible for them to even raise any objections and all that. So this is where I feel the board's responsibility is to ensure that all such complaints, or even they come to know about it, they should investigate it independently and ensure that the employee doesn't suffer. As against all these failures, of course, we have a lot of companies. We have Mr. Soota himself, like I said, most inspiring person. That are very well governed, and otherwise we wouldn't have had such a vibrant capital market. So I think one of the things that has happened in the recent past is a huge pressure from investors, to ensure, to see that companies are governed well. This helps, as I mentioned, to reduce the cost of capital and also to make the company sustainable in the longer run. Now, of course, we have the ESG regulations also. World over, disclosure requirements have leapfrogged, and SEBI has come up with the business responsibility and sustainability report, which has been mandated for the top 1,000 companies and from next year. In India, again, the ESG theme was really came from the fund managers and investors, and companies were keen to ensure that the capital availability will lead to reduced cost of capital. And besides, of course, now SEBI itself coming up with these disclosures, it becomes very important for companies and the boards particularly to look at ESG and come up particularly in the area of environment, to come up with long-term goals so that the investors and the larger public are aware the roadmap in which that company is progressing towards reducing its impact on the environment. And this is clearly a complex area and involves a lot of education, investor education, educating the employees. There will be disruption. So this is extremely challenging area. I won't spend time because already it's taken much time on the external mechanisms. I just want to mention that the when you look at market, I'm not very sure about market discipline sometimes, because there has been a whole lot of disclosure requirement from SEBI, the Companies Act, SEBI, RBI, all possible regulators. And it's becoming so huge that we do need a much deeper and incisive analysis of the disclosures. But markets, with all of that, it's not necessary. I mean, while markets reward good governance, I don't know whether the opposite happens entirely. It so much depends on the quarter-to-quarter profitability and share value and all of that. It's really a challenge to look at, long-term sustainability. And this is where I feel that to make, to ensure that companies survive in perpetuity, it is extremely important to look at long-term sustainability. And I'm sure that if explained properly, investors will understand that. Only one other point is really the IBC, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Code that has come in now. Of course, it has nothing to do with governance, but it has, indirectly become a tool for enhanced governance, because while the IBC really contributes to governance when a company goes into distress, the very fact that if a company defaults and consequently it gets into resolution process, both the management and the promoters would lose control, is hopefully sufficient to ensure that the companies are governed well. The boards realize, and I'm sure now in the case of the highly leveraged companies, surely they would be concerned about their ensuring that they are able to service all debt. And we do find that, in fact, companies have become very conscious of this excess leverage. And we've seen companies deleveraging. So in a way, even indirectly, the IBC threat, I'm not saying it's entirely IBC threat, but it does. And other, other actions that have been taken in several cases, whether it is SFIO, Enforcement Directorate, CBI, and all that, I guess it has brought about behavioral changes, and surely it's not business as usual. So I'm very hopeful that, like I said, unless companies are well governed, we wouldn't have attracted such a lot of capital, risk capital. So it is, the standards are high and governance is definitely improving, but clearly the boards and the independent directors need to ensure the long-term sustainability and value of the companies. Only that which will ensure that all the stakeholders are protected. I just read one quote, not a very, I don't remember who it was, but they said that governance and leadership are the yin and yang of successful organizations. If you have leadership without governance, you risk tyranny, fraud, and personal fiefdom. If you have governance without leadership, you risk atrophy. That means the company will just degenerate if you don't have leadership. That is basically the management. You risk atrophy, bureaucracy, and indifference. But of course, they're not separate. Like I said, the board has to ensure that they have effective leadership. Finally, the role of the board is to inspire and challenge. And this is a delicate balance, but one that must never derail because of insufficient scrutiny. The board has to function cohesively, but directors should not hesitate to offer their frank views or disagree with the CEO, challenge the CEO and management if required. For auditors, the term professional skepticism is used. I think for the boards, it has to be, and particularly the independent directors, it has to be constructive tension. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
The first question comes from Mr. Juzar Khorakiwala. Sir, please address your question, sir. And
Thank you,
request
sir.
all, just a minute, sir. Request all participants to put your questions in the chat section or raise your hand. I'll come to you.
Mrs. Gopinath, you did refer to whistleblower, and that was also working on my mind. When scams, frauds, misgovernance, whatever you call it, takes place in the organization, there are people involved in it at all levels. When serious things happen, and they don't speak up because they are party to the whole thing at various levels of the organization. Now, what should be the whistleblower kind of a policy, which can be very strict and very attractive for any individual within the organization at whatever level? Because obviously he has certain fears, he has certain, all these things are there in the back of his or her mind. But the policy should be such that it breaks away from all these fears and makes the person very bold to go out. And so any financial scheme or which is what you call institutionalized, as it happened in case of Ranbaxy's Daiichi matter, where the whistleblower got millions of dollars in the United States or wherever. Now, if something like this is mandated in India, so that all these things come out before a scam is actually brought to fruition, and because there are people involved, no single individual can commit a fraud. It has to have people across hierarchies and across functions to do it. So is there any thoughts you can share with us from maybe Ashok or maybe yourself, if something can be thought on those lines? Thank you.
First is like what I said, the independence of the whole process. Sometimes I've seen whistleblowing, they form a committee, but it will be from the management also. That doesn't make any sense at all, because you have these frauds where the top people are involved, and people below are really, have no choice sometimes, or they also benefit from that. So particularly in banks, for instance, it has become a major issue. And it's not necessarily, that in every case there is collusion and conspiracy of the bank's officials. Very few cases, in fact, I would say. But even then, the audit really is the credibility of the audit committee chair. Like Ashok was saying, that it's not just the high-profile nature of the director. A director who can be truly independent and who can really ensure that the complaint comes directly to the audit committee chair. It should not go through any other process, in the system. And an independent investigation should be conducted. As far as one other suggestion is, some of the whistleblower complaints that have come where I have seen in banks, really the whistleblower ultimately goes, sends a letter to the RBI. And and then the RBI is really then starts conducting an investigation. But it's very important for the internal, the audit committee itself, to ensure that the investigation is done. Otherwise, there is always, they try to defend the whole thing rather than ensure that the wrongdoers are really brought to book. So I do feel that a channel of communication, I feel like that, I don't know, probably the consequences could sometimes be, it will have unintended consequences, but a way in which one can report to the RBI. And one other way is that the RBI itself is requiring the inspectors come and see all the whistleblower complaints that have come. So if the regulators can look at that and ensure whether the processes adopted has been independent, and even anonymous should be taken into account. It's a real issue in giving the names. And therefore, if anonymous complaints are investigated, I think that will help. Ashok, you want to say?
No, I think you've given a perfectly comprehensive answer, but the last point is exactly what I was going to say. I think the only way to really remove fear from the system is also to allow anonymous complaints and investigate them appropriately also.
Sir, there is a question in the chat section from Mr. Uday Sanghani. You spoke of environmental and social issues such as climate change are top of mind for investors and shareholders. Do you see Indian companies putting together action plans for how their business models will support net zero economy by 2050? Is there a ESG task force which is focused on identifying the gaps or misstatements in companies? Disclosures are available for the climate change risks?
On this issue, there is a move for some kind of a ratings to support whatever disclosures and other statements that are made in the annual reports and sustainability reports of companies. SEBI has recently put out a consultation paper where some agencies, including rating agencies, maybe mainly research and rating agencies, analysts, will look at the business responsibility and sustainability reports, as well as other ESG disclosures that the companies make, and will probably provide some kind of a rating or assessment of such disclosures. I don't think there is any task force as such, because India will take, particularly our manufacturing companies will take time in the area of environment. See, in other areas like governance and social aspects, companies are moving forward and they are making these disclosures also. The whole issue is, are these disclosures real or they are greenwashing? What's called greenwashing. That's not happening. That is where these other agencies, third-party agencies, will come in. But in respect of environment, in the case of equity investors, they are not able to kind of lay down milestones and say our investment will be available only if you do this. They can only monitor after the investment is made. But debt providers are looking at the plans of the companies. So if you want to get debt, particularly from overseas, lot of funds, a huge pool of funds available for ESG teams. And if that is available, companies will, it can't be done very soon. So if they give a roadmap, lay down milestones of how they're going to achieve that, probably they will be able to attract investment. And these companies and the investors themselves will be able to even monitor how the investments are really being made. But many of these are still in initial stages. We are not very sure about the integrity of the whole process. Yeah. Ashok, you have been so much involved in sustainability and change yourself. You're doing it directly.
I actually agree with you again. One, that we were early on this in India. So therefore, the legislation, etc., is put in place. And I actually believe that, and you have to only read the annual reports, which I'm sure you see many more of all the companies. I think people are certainly taking it seriously. I mean, you have a sustainability section, you have people setting forth targets, and I think we really are in the right direction on that front.
Thank you, speakers. I think there are no more questions, and because almost I think you all have explained the entirety of it. And as we come to the close of this beautiful session, may I request Mr. Mr. Anand Singhania, President-elect, to kindly present the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir. So, hello.
He's muted, so.
1 minute, sir. 1 minute. Yeah. So, are you able to unmute yourself?
I'm now able to unmute myself.
Yeah, I think the message came very late to you. Okay.
Yeah. No, I could hear you, but I was unable to unmute myself. So very good evening to all of you. Sorry, I have been having some internet issues. So I had my video off and I kept getting disconnected. So I have actually not had the pleasure of hearing the wonderful session that we had, but I did hear snippets at the beginning towards the end. So It's my privilege to propose this vote of thanks at this end of this highly insightful talk. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Srimati Shyamala Gopinath, Independent Women Director of BASF India and former Deputy Governor, RBI, and as I just heard, Non-Executive Chairman of HDFC Bank.
Oh, sorry. Actually, I just retired from that post in 2021. I forgot to mention. Yeah. Sorry, maybe it's not gone into my record somewhere. Yeah. Okay.
No problem, ma'am. And Shri Ashok Soota, who is the Executive Chairman of Happiest Minds Technologies Limited, both of whom have readily responded to our request to be with us despite their busy schedules. As our speaker spoke, I at least believe that corporate governance is not like a tick box. It's not what you just need to tick. You need to live it, believe it, and you need to implement it in the spirit. And I think I'm very happy to know that several companies are actually doing it in the spirit and not just as it started, just to get into compliance. So I don't need to mention about corporate governance because enough has been said, but it's the art of directing and controlling the organization by balancing the needs of the various stakeholders. Whenever one speaks about corporate governance, it has to be borne in mind that organizations have duties and responsibilities towards their shareholders, stakeholders, and hence they need to be governed in accordance with the law and keeping in mind the interest of all the stakeholders and shareholders. I really deeply thank from the bottom of my heart Srimati Shyamala Gopinath and Shri Ashok Soota for their thought-provoking address that has enlightened us all and for taking questions from the audience as well. I must also thank all the participants for being with us today. Your presence is a source of encouragement to the chamber. May I also request if the speakers could give us permission to post this interactive session on our YouTube and social media handles, which are watched by several people. So
no problem.
And
Yeah. Yes.
is that
That's fine.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
so with that, thank you so much. So with that, thank you so much. Stay safe and take care, and hope to connect really soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye, Shyamala. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok, and thank you, Mrs. Gopinath. Thank you.